to these in a minute. When we speak about the spiritual life, one of the things that happens is there can be a curious insecurity that afflicts all of us, whether one's an ordained minister, a layperson, whether one's been praying for quite some time, or whether one's just starting out, and that is, sometimes we're just not sure if we're getting it right, or if anything is happening. And one of the important things is when we don't know what to look for in terms of really taking the temperature or the pulse of our spiritual life, we find that that confusion itself can be paralyzing. We have a hard time moving forward, but we're not comfortable with where we are because we're simply not sure whether we're on the right track or not. And so it can be very, very helpful to have a few benchmarks, especially if the benchmarks are reliable. One of the great things about St. Louis de Montfort was he had a very, very fine practical sense of just that need. And you can tell because these are questions he struggled with himself. How do I know, even if I'm convinced that this is the right way to go, that I'm doing it the right way? What do I look for? Because there's so many ways life just goes off the rails. Personal life, professional life, and spiritual life. So 2 weeks ago, when we talked about the importance of the Virgin Mary in the spiritual life, for Father de Montfort, the interesting thing was as soon as he answered his first and most basic question, what is the secret to really living a full, energetic, and strong Christian life? And discovering that that secret had a name and her name was Mary, he realized the first temptation was just to run and say, all right, what I need is a Marian devotion. I'll say my rosary, I'll wear my scapular, and I'll be good to go. And he realized there's something empty about just doing that. The issue is, and again, one of the great things about Father de Montfort was he was always looking not just for a good deal, but the best deal. What's not just a good way, but what's the best way to go forward? And the best way to go forward requires some thought, some care, and some attention. And so over the course of his life, as he looked at in his own life and in the examples of those whom he knew to be holy and trustworthy, he could identify what he considered 5 characteristics of a solid devotion to Our Lady. 5. The great thing about these 5 characteristics is whether one has a full and active devotion to Mary or not, these are 5 solid anchors of the spiritual life. And a strong case can be made that any spiritual life that doesn't have these 5 anchors, or that is missing one or more of them, is a spiritual life that isn't as strong as it could be or as it should be. And that in and of itself is really helpful, to say that there are 5 pieces that once we have them in place or we're moving toward them, we can be fairly certain that we're on the right track. And these 5 things are all also antidotes to 5 things that short-circuit us in our spiritual growth. And so by knowing these 5 characteristics, we know 2 things. What is the positive that I want to be moving toward? But also, what is the obstacle that this helps me overcome? Because let's face it, an awful lot can short-circuit us. An awful lot can get in the way and knock us off course. And sometimes we're not even quite sure what it is. We just know that something's going on. So that kind of clarity, 5 things. 5 things to begin looking at and building upon as a recipe for spiritual growth. And the nice thing about these 5 things is these are general, basic building blocks, which means any single one of us can put those 5 pieces together in a variety of different ways. It's not a one-size-fits-all recipe. It's simply saying, take these 5 pieces, make sure they're there, But the house you build upon, that's going to be uniquely your own, and uniquely the product of your particular relationship with the Almighty. So St. Louis de Montfort says, in speaking of devotion to Our Lady, but basically again in terms of all Christian prayer, the first characteristic is that it must be holy. And that's a word we throw around a lot. Holy. But who knows what it means? You know, isn't it interesting? We use the word a lot, don't we? But if you had to give a one-sentence definition of what holy is, it's a little slippery. We have this vague sense of it being connected to God and being set aside for good things and sacred purposes, but the actual concrete meaning of the word is difficult to tease out. And St. Louis de Montfort said that's one of the problems that we have. We have this vague, poorly formed understanding of what it is to live Christian life and what the demands of Christian discipleship really are. And so he begins with this word precisely because it can be a tricky word for us. He says, it's time we gave it content. So the first thing is, now let's take something that's generally vague for us and let's nail it down. And following the language of the Scriptures, Father de Montfort understands holiness in a very specific, very particular way. If you read the Old Testament carefully, one of the things that happens is you see that there's this remarkable reaction among the great saints and figures of the Old Testament the minute they realize that the angel of the Lord or the Lord himself is near and present to them. They're afraid. And they're specifically afraid that they're going to die. Isn't that remarkable? They're afraid that they're going to die because of the crushing weight of the holiness of God being more than their sinful life can bear. And the experience of the holiness of God as something that has no darkness, no shadow, no wickedness, and no sinfulness within it is the point that St. Louis de Montfort comes back to. Whatever else we may attach to the word holiness, from its most ancient roots in the Scripture, it always has the connotation of opposition to sinfulness. True growth in the spiritual life, precisely because it's holy, means it's going to make us face and begin dealing with our bad habits, our vices, and our sinfulness. Any spirituality that doesn't bring us sooner or later face to face with those aspects of our lives that aren't in conformity to the gospel is fantasy land. It's a recipe for escapism, but it's not a recipe for real spiritual growth. No. Holiness, in this sense, doesn't mean my life is suddenly free from all sin. It means it's beginning one thing at a time to begin facing what needs to be corrected in my life. It doesn't even mean I'm succeeding. Because let's face it, again, many of us will have these vices. We accumulated them over years. It's going to take a long time to get rid of them. But the issue is the engagement. Healthy spirituality, sooner or later, brings me to actively engage those aspects of my life that don't correspond to the gospel. Maybe not all at once, but certainly one at a time, at the very least, we begin working. And that's really important. Note then, one of the characteristics of spiritual life is there is a movement. A movement that means I face and accept the truth of myself as someone who has its good features and those elements of myself that need to be overcome so that I continue to grow. Following on that, St. Louis de Montfort says, a healthy devotion to Our Lady, a healthy spirituality is one that is disinterested. Not uninteresting, disinterested. And again, it's an unusual expression. It's disinterested. But again, if we think about our lives and think about the world around us, there's very much a what do I get out of it attitude that characterizes much of our experience of life. Everyone always seems to be out for himself. And look out for number one is just one of the drumbeats of our culture. If there's nothing in it for me, why should I do it? And spiritually, this can creep into our prayer life very, very easy. Because quite naturally, almost all of us begin praying by asking for what we need, right? All of us begin praying sooner or later by asking for help. And that is not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. How many of you guys have children? Let me see your hands for a second. Is it bad if your children ask you for what they need or what they want? No, you want them to do that, right? But is it an issue if that's all they say to you? That's a problem, right? The spiritual life can be that way too. The spiritual life can have a tendency of we pray most fervently when we really need something. We pray most frequently when we're in crisis. The old expression, there's no atheist in a foxhole. And when we're really young, we learn that too. You know, in school, I haven't studied for the test, and it's like, oh God, please help me. That is not, asking for what we need is not a bad form of prayer. The problem is prayer can very easily cross that line and that becomes primarily what we are doing. And when that happens, it's no longer saying to the Lord, how can I serve you? It's, let me tell you how you can serve me. That's the issue here. And so prayer that begins with turning to the Lord and saying, what can I do for you today? How can I know your will? How can I follow you today? Before I begin saying, and now this is what I need. What that does is it takes me away from being the center of the universe. And that really is the attitude of the culture in which we live. I'm the Lord and master of my own life, and everything has to be arranged around me. What I need, what I want, and on my time. In other words, God exists first to serve me. And when I'm well served, then I can turn to God. And that reverses things. And so the second bit, the bit about our prayer being disinterested, my spiritual life being disinterested, is that I learn to seek first. As Jesus says in the Scriptures, seek ye first the kingdom of God. I seek first the will of God before I ask for my own to be met. And as I do that, I even learn the proper framework within which I can begin asking for what I need. Then St. Louis de Montfort says, one of the other elements of a healthy spiritual life is its interior. Interior. As opposed to being merely exterior and shallow. In other words, it has depth and it has substance to it. And again, this is a tricky one. We want to take a close look at this. Because we can have these situations where people say, oh, I have no need for those external things. And that is not what Catholic spirituality teaches. Okay? And we can understand it this way. How many of you guys are married? Anybody here, let's see, married 30 years or more? in your marriage, okay? If you and your wife said, honey, I really love you, but you never saw any concrete proof of that, would you have made it 30 years?
I don't think you have to say it. I think if you live it.
If you saw no concrete proof, and all you had was a word, would it last?
No.
No, good. That was what I was looking for. You're right, you have to live it. But living it can't just be done inside, right? Living it can't just be done inside. If I say, I really am a generous person, but I never give anybody anything, that internal generosity I have is a lie. It's a dream of generosity. It's not reality. If I say I really love you, but you can't tell that, however much I want to fool myself into thinking I'm a loving person because I have these loving feelings inside of me, it's a lie. It's just the dream. And so to say healthy spirituality is interior doesn't mean that there's no external component. In fact, think about how we teach our children how to pray, or how we learn how to pray. We're brought to church for the first time, and we learn to take the holy water, and we feel the water on our fingers, and we learn little by little to make the sign of the cross. And at first we're awkward and we're not sure where we're going with it, but eventually we get the right movement down. We learn how to genuflect. These are exterior things, right? But they're not without value. These are like the rain that comes down on the soil of the heart, so that the seed of faith that's there can be watered and begin to grow. External signs and practices are necessary. We have to have them. They're what water the heart in the first place. The problem is if all they remain is mere gestures. It's like buying your wife flowers, but you really could care less. You know, well, great, she's got flowers, but... yeah, and we know the difference in our relationships. We know a false gesture or an empty gesture from a real one. So St. Louis de Montfort says, a true spirituality takes the external practices and allows them to penetrate the heart. But once they penetrate, and this is important, that seed that grows beneath the soil of the heart, or beneath any soil, does it do any good if it never pierces the surface of the soil and bears fruit? That's useless too, right? The same thing. The virtues and the dispositions that our prayer life begins rooting within us sooner or later have to manifest themselves in how we act, in how we live, and in what we do. That's important too. And internal spirituality is one that has been shaped concretely by our external practices, by going to church every Sunday, by the devotions that we have, by the disciplines we have. But it produces life within us that allows a generosity to manifest itself, a patience to manifest itself, a goodness to manifest itself, a way of praying that's not merely just repeating the words. Again, we teach our children the Our Father and the Hail Mary, so that when it's time for them to pray on their own, they know how to do it. And these external prayers, the words, become the seed beds that teach them how to pray from the heart. And later on, even if they're just using those same words, even though the ear hears the same thing, the way those words are being said is different. It comes from a deeper place. So, an interior dimension to spirituality which brings substance to our prayer and becomes a source of action for us. The fourth characteristic that St. Louis de Montfort talks about, and this is the key one, is true devotion to Our Lady, solid Catholic spirituality is constant. Constant. And the biggest enemy of spiritual growth for many of us is simple lack of constancy. Simple lack of constancy. grow by fits and starts, don't we? We can have those experiences of, for whatever reason, something is going on in life, or I really responded to Father's homily, and I really want to take my faith life seriously. And so I begin praying with more attention and more frequency, and I do some spiritual reading, and I try to bear it down. I get involved in a couple things that are going on in the church. And 2 months later, where am I? Often that extra prayer has kind of drifted away. I realize I overcommitted and overextended myself. And so I pull back. I just can't manage my time the way I thought I could. And so what happened? You know, the rush of the experience wore off. The prayer doesn't feel the way it did a couple weeks ago. Where am I? Oftentimes, that movement I made with such enthusiasm comes up short, comes up empty, and I'm a little hesitant before I try anything new again. Because I know what happened last time. It didn't last. Lack of constancy. One of the classic examples I run into all the time is somebody makes a retreat or goes on a program and comes back and they're all fired up, and next thing you know, they're involved in 6 groups in the church, they're volunteering their time, they're going to pray their rosary every day, read scripture every day, and about a week later they're making their entire family miserable. Because they're having a hard time holding on to this themselves. You know, the Jesuits have a great joke. You know what a Jesuit martyr is? He's the guy who lives in the same house as the Jesuit saint. Sometimes when we bear down with all kinds of intensity, and everybody else around us is puzzled by this change in us, and then they're even more puzzled when the change doesn't last. Lack of constancy. And oftentimes what happens is when we try to grow spiritually, our inconstancy manifests itself in a couple different ways. And the one is, like I said, my favorite class in school growing up was shove and tell. Sometimes what happens is we make this kind of a mistake in the spiritual life. We think we can walk across... Now, it shouldn't be hard for me to walk across the room from here to those doors, right? But if I try to do it like this, it's pretty laughable, right? And before I get very far, I'm going to fall flat on my face and make a fool of myself. A lot of times in the spiritual life, that's exactly what we do. We want everything to be better right away. And because we feel motivated, we think we can do more than we really can. And so rather than making a simple beginning, we try to walk with giant steps. And we can get 1, maybe 2 steps like that. And then I'm pulling my muscles or I'm losing my balance, and I'm out of energy, and I'm flat on my face. Why? I try to do too much. Better than the hour a day that you don't have is 10 good minutes that you do have. Better than 3 or 4 hours once a week of prayer is 10 or 15 minutes every day. Why? In 10 or 15 minutes every day, I'm saying, God, I am all yours today, every day. Those 3 or 4 hours I do once a week, God, I am all yours on Thursday. Simple steps and humble steps faithfully taken are better than giant steps made once in a while. One of the keys of constancy is to do what we can do with reasonable expectations. When our expectations are unreasonable, we're going to fall and we're going to fail. The same way when I try to turn my life around, if I try and reorient everything all at once, I can maybe hold on to that for 2 weeks. And then it's too much and it all gets away from me and I'm worse than I was before. But if I pick one thing and start there and begin working, Usually 2 or 3 others, without my even trying, come right along with it. But it's also something I can manage and something I can do. Humble, simple steps are the best way. And God, for whom 1,000 years is like a single day, can grace those 10 or 15 minutes that I give him every day in a way that's just as full as those 3 hours once a week and more. And that's important too. But that pattern of turning to the Lord constantly, faithfully, and simply without trying to do too much is very important. The second enemy to constancy is this. Has anybody here ever experienced a time when your prayer just felt dry and empty? And I'm going to be the first to put my hand up. It's amazing how often that happens, isn't it? And what happens when the prayer dries up like that? And it becomes a fight, and the mind is wandering, and we're distracted. Isn't it amazing how quickly we stop? And who just won? Satan. Dryness in our prayer is something we don't know how to navigate and something we don't talk about enough. And because we don't, we assume that something must be wrong with the way I'm praying because it doesn't feel the way it used to. Or it doesn't feel like I think it should feel. Prayer's not a feeling. Prayer's not a feeling. Sometimes prayer has feeling to it, but not always. And it's important that we understand that. We can think about it this way. If when I pray it's always consoling and always fulfilling, always rich, am I praying because I love God or because I like the feeling? I like the consolation. I like the blessing. I like the gift. But when it's not that, and I'm there anyway, that's different, isn't it? And this is important. We'll go back to my friend over here and his long marriage. Every day is a picnic, right?
Perspective is a big part of that.
Okay. For any real relationship to work, we have to recognize sooner or later it costs us something to be in that relationship. You know? Any knucklehead in the world can say, honey, I love you for better, for health, and for wealth, right? But you don't know whose commitment is real until it becomes difficult to stay. I know who my friends are, not when life is going good. I just know who wants something. I know who my friends are when life is difficult, and they're with me. And the same thing in your marriage, and on all levels. You know, the real measure of the love that you feel is when you know your spouse pays a price to be with you. When your family knows your commitment and experiences your commitment precisely in how hard you have to work and how much you have to give up to be for them. And on some levels, that's also how much you know you love your family and how much you know you love your wife, isn't it? It makes you feel the strength of your commitment. It shows you the depth of it surfaces for you a depth you maybe didn't even know was there. Dry prayer is that for us. That's that moment of, it's not about me, it's about you, Lord. I'm not getting anything that I can feel here, but you're important to me, and so I'm here. And it's God's way, because sometimes God withdraws from us. Sometimes God becomes silent. Sometimes God doesn't give us that consolation to call us to that faithfulness of being present in that moment. Because just like in a marriage, it's only the couple that can meet the difficult moment of life that can really enjoy the good moment. It's the same thing in the prayer life. It's that one who can persevere when it's not easy and when it costs me something to pray, who's really going to appreciate the blessing and the consolation when it arrives again. And that's important. That's really important. And so consolation in prayer is not always a reliable marker. That's why faithfulness is so important. The constancy. Whether it's consoling or not, here I am. And that prayer values an awful lot because it's a gift that I give God. It's not about what I'm getting. At that point, I really am giving. And that kind of a sacrifice produces great, great fruit in the spiritual life. And the last mark that St. Louis de Montfort says a good and healthy, solid spiritual life should have is it should be confident. It should be confident and trust-filled. That's really important. Trust is, again, something in the world and the culture around us we have all kinds of trouble with. You know, is there anybody here who's never been disappointed? I thought so. We've all been disappointed. And when we've been burned, we always have our guard up, don't we? And when we have our guard up, how free are we? Oh, not very. Not very, because a lot of my energy and my attention has to go to keeping my guard up. This is true in our interpersonal relationships with our family members, our friends, and our co-workers, and it's true in the spiritual life too. Trust and freedom are related to one another. If you don't trust your co-worker to do a good job, are you as free as you should be to do your job? Not really, if you've got to rely on him, right? You're always looking over your shoulder, worried about what he's going to mess up and how you're going to have to cover for him. And because you can't trust him to do his share of the work, you're not completely free to do your own work. But if you know you're working with a guy you can count on, you don't have to worry. You can just do your job. And you know the other piece of the project is going to get done. There's a real difference, isn't there? If I don't trust that guy, I have a hard time working with him. In a relationship, and this is a great way to measure the health of a relationship. In a relationship, if I think you're going to blow up on me if I'm honest with you, odds are I'm not going to be free to be honest with you, right? Note how the freedom decreases with regard to the lack of trust that I have? If I think you'll at least hear me out, and even if you don't agree with what I say, you'll at least respect it, I at least have a chance of talking to you, of being open to you. The same thing in the spiritual life. When I really allow myself to truly believe that God is my Father, that I share life with Jesus, and that God will support those he calls. When I really believe that, then I'm able to step out and take a risk serving him. If I don't believe that, I'm not going to do a thing. Real spirituality over time begins building up within me a confidence and a trust in God that allows me to step out of myself and do something. And the neat thing about that is when I do it and I see that God does indeed have my back, it becomes easier to take the next step. Just like in our relationships. When I see that someone meets me and respects me, it becomes easier to say more and to be more honest with that person. In the spiritual life too. This is important because this is what takes me out of myself in terms of action. Now I can serve God. Now I can do something for the church because I really do trust. I trust God. I trust his people. And because of that, I feel free. I feel free to take a shot and do something. So those are the 5 marks. Holy, interior, disinterested, constant, and trust-filled. One last thing, getting back to the exterior. Things like crosses and statues and even rosaries are tools, okay? And just like physical tools that we work with that we use to fix things around the house that we need for our job. If you have a badly made tool, is it any good to use? Same thing here. Use all of your spiritual tools, but when you have tools, get good ones that are solid and reliable. There's a reason why 100 and 200 years ago, crosses and statues and things like this were made out of metal. Because you could hold it in your hand, and close your fingers around it, and not worry about it breaking. And you could feel the strength and the substance. And let's face it, sometimes at the end of the day, when life has just beat you down, there's just not a word to bring to the prayer. But being able to take your hand and close it around something like this, and feel its weight and its substance and its strength, that's an anchor. And that's a prayer. The same thing with something like the rosary. A rosary that you're worried about falling apart is a distraction and it's not reliable. And in the end, using things like that, what does that do to us sometimes? It gives us the impression that somehow spirituality is fragile and that prayer is weak. But something that you know isn't going to break, isn't going to go anywhere. Something that's not too small for your fingers to feel, to hold. Something with weight and substance and dignity. Again, it's external, yes. But these external things can be reminders, concrete reminders of what we're called to be and what our prayer can be. If what I use to pray with is weak, it's harder to pray with strength. You know, and the interesting thing is, for hundreds of years, Christians had things like these. And, you know, this little metal statue, why is it this size?